Hey everyone. Today I have with me for some discussion Raoul Eshelman, professor of Slavic literature at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, and formulator of the framework Performatism, which has been very influential in broader post-postmodern conversations and something that I've been very influenced by. It's probably best articulated in Eshelman's book, Performatism, or the End of Postmodernism. It's also, you also have an article that was included in the discussion that is the Metamodernism, Historicity, Affect, and Depth After Postmodernism anthology. And I would say, generally speaking, have been working in that sort of similar space of analyzing and theorizing postmodernism, or what comes after postmodernism, through the lens of kind of cultural analysis and assessment and theorizing about cultural production. And for my money, I think doing it incredibly brilliantly and incredibly insightfully. So it's a joy and an honor to have you for some discussion today. And I guess, yeah, let's just kind of hop into it. I think that, probably a lot of people who are watching this or are familiar with the stuff I'm doing are probably basically conversant in metamodernism. So it might be helpful if you just wanted to give a little bit of an overview, or just some summary, some important kind of, kind of basic presentation of performatism, and maybe how that fits into conversations around postmodernism. And yeah, I guess let's start there.
Okay, that's that's a tall order to begin with. It's difficult to say where to begin. I think one thing that distinguishes what I do from almost everyone else is that I insist on on history. In other words, on reinstating a excuse me, on reinstating a kind of epical concept of history, where you have a dialectical relationship between different cultural dominants. And a lot of people say this, but they tend not to do it ultimately. So performatism, as I understand it, is an attempt to draw this boundary line between postmodernism and what comes afterwards as precisely as possible. It's obviously not possible to do with absolute rigor, but to set up as many criteria as possible to distinguish postmodernism from what comes after it, and not fudge and not hedge and not do any fence straddling. Yeah. So that's my basic approach, and I believe I'm almost alone in this endeavor. In other words, this insistence on old history. I think this is something that is important from my point of view, that old history assumes that there are epochs, that these epochs are based on kind of antagonistic or opposing approaches to the world, to culture, to life, and that and the history is marked by how we designate, or how we understand these epochs. And this is something that I think that this is one of my main points. That would be I think a good start.
Okay. Well, wait, so maybe there's a little bit we can unpack there, because one thing that I want to get into in a minute is there are some distinct sort of strategies, or maybe a better word would be kind of devices or forms, genres, artistic mechanisms that are used, that you outline in your discussion of performatism, that I think can, one, kind of help fill in some of the specifics about how this works, and two, I think also just generally kind of explain its essence by means of those different strategies that are deployed. But so we can dig into some of like what these forms, what these kind of typically performatist forms and styles and genres are. But I'm curious, say more a little bit about this historical element and the dialectic that you're referring to, because I find that maybe an interesting point of distinction between, as you're saying, kind of separating you from what other folks are doing.
Yeah, well, the idea is that obviously postmodernism is still present in people's value systems, in artistic norms, in the way people approach things, so that it hasn't disappeared and it won't disappear entirely. But what has happened is that many of the devices used in postmodernism have been turned around, as it were, and are now used in ways that are utterly. I think this is also one of my main points, is that what might superficially look like something postmodern, a very complicated plot structure, something like this, that these kind of things are aimed not at creating some sort of ironic distance towards the subject matter, but rather focus on transcendence. And this is the other very, very important point that I try to make, that of all the things that, of all the possible topics, subjects, goals that you find in the new epoch, this focus on transcendence, or this set towards transcendence, is probably the most important one. It's the most important way of getting out of postmodernism, because postmodernism is about immanence. It's about never being entrapped in a world full of signs, and a world full of false signs, a world full of signs that basically block our access to direct reality. So this is I think the second point. The second important point would be this focus on transcendence, or set to transcendence, which doesn't necessarily mean that angels have to be flying around flapping their wings. It's not usually, it doesn't necessarily have to involve unreal things happening, or unbelievable things happening, but it does involve overcoming a certain situation in a very distinct way. And this is something that, at least as far as I've been able to, never happens in postmodernism, is that you wind up in postmodernism always with a conundrum, in a dead end, with an an aporitic situation which goes on endlessly. But there is, in a certain sense, no way of transcending these traps that postmodern science set for us. And this is the second point that is very important to me. It's also important to the metamodernists, with whom I don't agree on everything.
Yeah, well, and that would be an interesting thing that I'd like to talk about too, is maybe some of those distinctions. But say a little bit more about that. What do you think were the historical circumstances that kind of lie behind this shift away from radical immanence and the conundrum and the problematizing to transcendence, and the shift to try to escape the frame, as you put it?
Yes. Also, this is hard to say in what causes it. In terms, let us say, in real life terms. I'm always very, very careful about making these kind of statements, because it's very, very difficult to prove. Was it the fall of the Berlin Wall? I think Christian Moraru, that's his thesis, and there was 9/11. There are all kinds of different attempts to find causal relationships between political events, economic events in the real world, and what happens in the world of culture. And I find this to be a very difficult endeavor. To give one example, the whole problem of globalization is something that was already happening in postmodernism. It's from my point of view that Frederick Jameson, who most of your viewers are familiar with, gave an excellent Marxist, neo-Marxist analysis of this situation, and he linked it explicitly with postmodernism. Postmodernism was, in a certain sense, the expression, the embodiment of this globalization of capitalism. And the problem is that globalization has become even more intense than it was when Jameson was writing in the 80s and 90s. It's become absolutely universal. There's almost nothing left that has not been touched by social media, by global capitalism. I was just reading about a girl in the Amazon forest who had 6 million TikTok followers because she created an enormous bug. People like that. There's no part of the world that has not been touched by that. But the thing is that instead of seeing an intensification of postmodernism, we've seen an opposite reaction. So a sort of a one-to-one link between things like global capitalism, globalization, the mediatization of the world, it's just not a one-to-one relationship. The way I see it is that this is basically, for the most part, this switch was caused by postmodernism simply drying out, simply becoming dull, becoming boring to both creative people and also to audiences. I distinctly remember going into a Coen Brothers film sometime around 2005, 2006. I think it was Burn After Reading. And it was just, I knew what everything was going to happen. There were no surprises. The CIA is incompetent. Everything is a paranoid conspiracy. Everything is farcical, and it wasn't fun anymore. These were things I enjoyed when I was reading Kurt Vonnegut, maybe back in the 1970s or 80s, but it just was. It worked. It seemed to me to be very tired, and I think this is what happens in aesthetic terms. These are the only things that I can actually talk about with any authority. The economic political developments have some influence, but certainly nothing direct.
Yeah, it's interesting too that you mentioned that book, or that film, because I remember distinctly the end of that movie is there's sort of this befuddled moment of what did all this mean? It didn't really mean anything. It was all pointless and worthless, and it's sort of like there's something kind of quintessentially, an expression of that exhaustion there. And you could almost argue that what you're saying is that these new modes are sort of expressive of an exhaustion with the exhaustion. There's the sense of an end has ended. There's so many threads here. I want to kind of explore a couple of them. One is that you mentioned this dialectic situating of your ideas in terms of old history and whatnot. And so it sounds like maybe you're reticent to put your thumb on distinct causes of these broad shifts, but you're not reticent as much to theorize about them in broader terms. So how do you frame these shifts within that kind of old history and that kind of dialectic framework that you're talking about?
Well, the original starting point is very technical. It's semiotic, and this is probably a good way to turn off a lot of viewers by talking about signs and semiotics. So I won't go into it too much, but basically the starting point was that signs in postmodernism basically point to other signs. They are the famous simulacra. And these signs, you have no direct way of experiencing reality except through signs. And because signs are naturally duplicitous, because they can be replicated, they can be falsified, you have no chance of actually having any sort of authentic approach to reality, or any authentic apprehension of reality. And when I started out, the thing that I was looking for was a kind of sign that would do that. And what I found was a concept by a man named Eric Gans, who developed the idea of an ostensive sign, of a sign that is present, that points to something, and that two people intuitively agree on. And this kind of sign is below the threshold of discourse, because discourse in postmodernism is what confuses us, is what makes us, what splits us apart, what decentrifies us. And so this was a kind of sign that did the opposite. It created the possibility for two people to come together if they could spontaneously agree on what a certain present sign meant. And that was the starting point. This is one of the dialectical moments, you could say, in my thinking, is that there was this is a change. This is not some sort of, it's either or. It's a thesis antithesis, if you will, and it's not something that is it's not something that is simply a variant of postmodernism. It's dialectical opposite.
Well, and so this is, yeah, I really want to kind of dive into this because it seems like a very important component to your framing of this is really it deals with how people think of the world and reality, which is to say, kind of what people's metaphysics is, or at least the dominant paradigm, metaphysical paradigm. And so I'm intrigued at a number of different levels, because one of the ways that one of these devices, these performatist devices that you talk about, which I want to explore, is artistically mediated belief. And in that you talk about sort of doing metaphysics by means of post-metaphysical tools or something like that. So say a little bit about what you mean by post-metaphysical, because this term also comes up in other areas that are interested in these postmodern spaces. Well, let's just start there. So when you say post-metaphysical, describe that and what that means.
Okay. Well, let's start with what is metaphysical. That metaphysical is somebody who says straightforwardly, I believe in God, I believe in angels, I believe in, I simply believe in something, and there is no particular way that's mediated. And this sort of thinking obviously is religious believers obviously still do this, but in our secular society, it's not certainly not a dominant or even probably very prevalent sort of attitude. What postmodernism, in particular post-structuralism, does is to show how these sort of metaphysical beliefs reappear in hidden ways. I think this is the whole thrust of post-structuralism, is to show that even when we try to be rational, when we try to be logical, that we still have these metaphysical assumptions somehow, that everything is tied together, that we can explain things, that we can achieve preset goals, this sort of thing. And so the whole logic of postmodernism, post-structuralism, I think, is to debunk this kind of hidden metaphysical thinking, or covert metaphysical thinking. And this is where irony comes in, the famous ironic attitude of postmodernism, that it's about debunking this kind of misguided rationalist thinking. what performatism does, or what the post-postmodern post-postmodern aesthetics does, post-postmodern works of art, literature, is not to return to simple professions of belief. I think this is one very important thing, because no one who has gone through postmodernism, no person of culture who has gone through postmodernism is simply going to revert to an attitude where it says, well, I believe in this figure in this movie because he or she has some sort of sacral, authentic character that I identify with directly. Almost nobody would do that. So what happens in performative works is that we are essentially forced to identify with these kind of characters.
So there's this sense that we can't do the metaphysical thing, but in terms of like logically, assent to its propositions, but we can engage with an aesthetic work of art, and we can kind of feel the metaphysical kind of transcendence that was spoken of, and then we're sort of left with a decision of what to do with that. And so I'm curious then, does this open up a kind of chasm or a deep rift, a cognitive dissonance between kind of the mind and the feeling, the head and the heart, and how does that factor into this?
Possibly, yes. I don't experience that myself, at least as a viewer or recipient of these works of art. What I think happens, though, is that this attitude of being able to believe overpowers rationality, essentially. Once more in an aesthetic setting. In real life, you can go back to being a skeptic, you can go back to being ironic, you can go back to being whatever you are. But within the when you engage with this particular work, you will be moved by it in some way, and because you have been forced to believe, I believe that has the power to change people, perhaps imperceptibly, and certainly it does have the power to change the aesthetic values of people, to make them more open to works of art that promote belief in some way.
Now, I'm curious, and this is a big area for me right now, because let's say you've got someone who's fully, they've done this thoroughly, they've experienced this sensibility very much in our culture and different cultural production and artworks and whatnot, and it's fully kind of become embodied and imbibed such that that belief sort of has taken hold. What then how does this navigation between there's sort of this uncritical naivete that begins, and then there's sort of the debunking that postmodernism does, as you refer to, and the kind of disillusionment and that move, and then there's this performatist thing that's sort of like, well, we're gonna do the believing thing, but just in the frame, and if you're really caught up in it, you'll feel that, and it'll change your mode of perception and your mode of engagement with reality. Now, let's say someone does come out of that and they do want to project that believing attitude back onto the world. Is there something qualitatively different about that form of belief than that uncritical naivete belief, that it's passed through, as you've said earlier, that once you've kind of done the deconstructive postmodern thing, you can't just go back to, asserting some kind of naive belief in a thing. And yet, once you've gone through the performatist thing, you're sort of back at a belief structure in some way. So talk a little bit about how those differences might exist as people come out of that and project that back onto the world, and really embody a kind of performatist sensibility.
Well, in terms of ideology, I would say that in let us say the bad old days of modernism, when people believed in utopian ideals, the result was totalitarian. I think this is a common knowledge that the idea that these ideals could be realized somehow in the real world led to absolute disaster. In other words, the totalization of these beliefs was an absolute disaster, and nobody does that. Would do that. Our performatists wouldn't do that anymore. Because the beliefs that they experience or have are particular in a very special sense. In other words, they're confined to certain set circumstances, certain set situations, and at least theoretically, they are they cannot be or should not be totalized in the way that modernist belief was. So that would be one difference, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I mean, there is something that persists of that postmodern awareness even after the performatist naivete, or I'm intrigued by Kierkegaard wrote a lot about irony, which of course, again, as you noted, is very very bound up with postmodern forms of cultural production, and he was interested in these forms of reflection and immediacy, and irony being highly self-reflexive, and immediacy being kind of the opposite of that. And he spoke a lot about this notion of what's sort of sought after reflection, which, there's immediacy, which is sort of that uncritical naivete. Then there's reflection, which is this sort of brings in this element of disillusionment often, or at least that kind of, awareness that renders that immediacy impossible. But then he speaks of a second naivete, or a second immediacy, which of course would be kind of dialectically transfigured by its whole, going through this process. And yet it does regain something of that original naivete, that immediacy, albeit, in a new form. Is something like that a fair expression of where someone living in a performatist kind of world might land?
It could be. In absolute ideal terms, let's say that a performatist person would try to resist engaging in discourse as much as possible, because discourse has the same. Discourse is a postmodern, is the place where postmodernism happens. Discourse is endless. It's endless. It's a bad imminence, so to speak.
But you mean discourse in a
forever.
specific sort of way, like not discourse in
Yeah.
the sense of conversation. You mean a particular kind of postmodern discourse, which is
And what I think what the ideal performatist viewer would be let us say be inspired. That's also a key word that Peter Sloterdijk uses, would be inspired by this particular engagement with the work that inspires belief, and would project that onto others by way of imitation. In other words, this person could encourage others to imitate him or her. This would be, in a certain sense, the ideal attitude would be by taking let us say a certain ethical posture in a certain situation, that you could encourage other people to imitate you. And this is one of the things that I also touch on in ethical terms, that I draw a lot on Alain Badiou and his notion of ethics, that of adhering to a truth process. And this is one way of transmitting ethics in a performatist way, without engaging in a lot of blah blah blah, a lot of discourse. Is you place yourself in a situation where you can act as an example for others.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious what you would think of. I mean, obviously, you're analyzing art, photography, literature, etc., that sort of cultural production. But I'm curious what you might kind of think are the implications of this for religion and contemporary spirituality in terms of these ideas about artistically mediated belief, performatist belief. How do you think that maps onto actual sort of spiritual commitments or lifestyles, practices, sort of post-metaphysical commitments?
You are probably better off asking Linda Ceriello and Greg. I think you already asked Greg Denber, but I think they've done very nice work on that, showing how actual, spiritual values or attitudes are conveyed through popular culture. That's not really my. I'm not so much involved in that kind of sort of semi-sociological research into popular culture, but that it would go in that direction. Basically, I follow their work fairly closely, and I found that very helpful in thinking about exactly the question you asked. How does that exert itself in popular culture, for example? And I think they really can show that, in TV shows and in popular series, that these things also appear, and that it also appears in basically in popular forms of spirituality, which are very variegated, which are very heterogeneous.
Sure. I was interested actually that you were on a panel that I think that Tom and Mark organized around metamodernism and post-postmodernism, and you said something which struck me, which is, and maybe if I heard you right, I thought you were saying that the performatist devices that you were noting in your book, for example, Performatism in 2008, are not as, you don't see them as much, that it's not as maybe dominant as it used to be. Was I understanding you correctly, or how would you say, where does performatist art kind of stand today in 2021? Is it very much the cultural dominant, or has it receded in some way?
What I've seen up to now, obviously, it's difficult to have a complete overview of what's going on. I follow things in American culture, in Russian culture, as best as I can, but there are just limits to what I can process. Let's put it that way. So that what I see is, to a certain extent, haphazard. I haven't really done this systematically. What I have been seeing is that the initial optimism that you found in the late 90s with, let's say, the Dogma movies, which were very so constructed that you really believed, you really had hope, you really, they sometimes also created really directly transcendent situations that you were supposed to believe in. This sort of thing has become less prominent. Let's put it this way. I think it still happens, but the feeling I have, particularly in regard to Russia, Russian movies, Russian literature, is that there is a mode of pessimism that is returning even within the framework of this kind of performative work. And the problem with Russia is obviously that the political, the social, the cultural situation there is extremely is not good. I mean, it's not something that you can be optimistic about. It's a little bit different in the West, but this same sense I think is creeping in. I have been looking for some sort of switch, some sort of dialectical switch, but at the moment I haven't found it. I haven't found a work that really breaks with performatism. I can say this with some authority about how this feeling works, because in the 1990s, when I started when I got the idea of performatism, I found works, I found films, novels that I didn't understand, basically, that I couldn't explain with my post-structuralist, post-modern values, norms, concepts. And I'm waiting for this to happen again. I'm looking for something that I really can't explain. And then you have to start all over again. But up to now, it hasn't happened to me personally. This is the only thing. But obviously, this initial mode of optimism has abated.
You mentioned also some differences in how you see things from maybe the metamodern paradigm. Talk a little bit about that, the relationship of performatism and metamodernism as you see it.
Metamodernism is we agree on a lot of things. First of all, we agree on the importance of transcendence. This is something that I think is absolutely crucial to diagnosing our situation, and they do a very good job of working that out. We also agree on. I think we also agree in terms of the sensibility is the same. In other words, when I read their analyses in the website, or also, of course, in the book, I'm almost in complete agreement with what they find to be metamodern, or what I would find to be performatist. There's in terms of this sensibility, there is a great deal of agreement. The disagreements are about history and how it works. And my approach is the exact opposite of theirs. I think this is the clearest way to say it. Basically, what the metamodernists do in their historical approach is to take a definition of romanticism as the oscillation between enthusiasm and irony. It's I think Schlegel said this sometime in the early 19th century, and they project it onto cultural history, so that you have modernism as is enthusiastic, and of course has other qualities relating to enthusiasm, and postmodernism is ironic. And the problem with this approach is that it completely excludes anything that is not romantic. In other words, there's no room in their conception for anything that is anti-romantic, non-romantic. And one thing that is very unromantic is to impose formal, through formal rigor, to impose restrictions upon viewers, people, characters. This is absolutely unromantic. So that my approach is, once more, is dialectical, in the sense that if postmodernism is ironic, if it's not being, it's not opposed to enthusiasm, which is also another romantic trope. It's being opposed to a kind of, I would say, neoclassical rigor. The whole idea of framing, the whole idea of imposing force upon viewers, people, characters, is something that you would find in the classicist tradition, that is simply that doesn't, the metamodernists don't even recognize exists. And this is a very, very basic difference in the approach to history. When they say that, I think Tim Vermeulen likes to say that there is what is it? It's metamodernism is part of an emergent neo-romantic sensibility. The problem is that modernism is also neo-romantic, and postmodern is also neo-romantic, and so you have an unbroken skein of neo-romantic epistemes or epochs that simply oscillate back and forth without encountering any resistance from any other from any other side. And I think this is the difference between old history of which I am a happy representative, and post history, which basically doesn't recognize any sort of dialectical friction between epochs or epistemes.
Is that because post history seems to be identifying some kind of metaphysical commitment in that kind of old history approach, that there needs to be, that there's a presumption of some, what is the dialectical thing moving through history, and then they get scared by that essentially. So because this is another factor that I'm really interested in, is how the theorizing of postmodernism is also exemplary of, or it can be exemplary of different paradigms itself, right? You could be doing postmodern theorizing from a postmodern perspective. You could also be doing it from a postmodern perspective, hypothetically, right? And that those might yield different sorts of visions for how to theorize what postmodernism is. And so I think you've kind of hit on an interesting one, which is like, there's a post history and an old history way of doing things, which in some ways centers on metaphysical concerns. And you could almost argue, maybe you would, or maybe you wouldn't want to go this area, where you're almost doing a performatist conceptualization of postmodernism, because you're taking in some metaphysical ideas, but maybe through post-metaphysical means. Is that a silly thing, or do you think there's some kernel of truth in there?
No, I think that's fairly accurate. I think, though, that the whole problem of the fear that the dialectic is metaphysics. I think the problem is if you tie the dialectic to a goal, to a metaphysical goal, then you have problems. We're in the 19th century with Hegel or with Marx.
Now, this is where I'm interested too, because I want to ask you about the developmental metamodernists. I don't know how you want to call them. You could call them the Nordic metamodernists, or doing political metamodernism, which is to say a tradition engaging with metamodernism as a concept, picks it up from Vermeulen and Vandenacker, and sort of takes it in other directions. Are you familiar, for example, with the work of Hansi Freinacht?
No, I actually know very little about the Nordic variant.
Okay. I'd be interested, just to hear what you would say about their historical analysis, or the way that they view metamodernism through a historical lens, or interpret it through that way, because it also incorporates dialectic, arguably in a post-metaphysical way. And anyway, that would be an interesting thing to bring into the mix. But it makes sense too. Right now, there's so much sort of there still remains kind of a cleavage in the different lineages that are talking about postmodernism, that there's sort of a cultural studies angle, and then there's often sort of this other kind of political metamodernist or developmental, and there's not always a whole lot of bridge. In fact, one of the things I want to do in some ways with this podcast is kind of start bringing more of these voices into conversation. I mean, you yourself, though, were on that panel with Daniel Gortz, for example, the panel I mentioned earlier that Tom and Mark had organized. So there is a lot of these discussions that are starting to come together, and I think it could be interesting to see. I want to go back to the idea of transcendence, because, as you say, it's so key to this sensibility in this moment, and the search for that kind of transcendence. I know you've sort of theorized it a little bit, but say a little bit more about what that word means in all of its sort of semantic range, at least, or maybe you're using it in a very narrow sense. But when you talk about transcendence and performatism, what does that mean?
It means a lot of things. It can appear, first of all, it can appear thematically, that in other words, that somebody has in a fictional work of art of some kind, you can always depict the things that are unreal, that basically that transcend the particulars of our life world. And this happens too. It's not necessarily the rule, but it is something you'll find in performatist works. At the other end of the spectrum, let's say, at the very most minimal level or threshold of transcendence, you'll find the event. I think this is in narrative terms, that something happens, something changes in a dialectical way, in the crossing of a binary boundary, whatever, and that this change is marked, is in a certain sense then guaranteed by the structure of the particular work you're watching or reading. And in between there are, and this event can be grounded in the real world, in the world completely in the real world we live in.
I like how you pointed to a simulacrum when you said
yes,
the real world.
I pointed to a simulated thing behind us, but basically this is it can be grounded in what we consider to be reality. But what is important is this idea of a unified, sort of a monist experience that something has to change. It can be fairly subtle in that regard. And this is also why you have one area of postmodern theorization likes to talk about a return to authenticity or to realism. This is very strong in Germany. Possibly less so in America. And in between, there's a whole multitude of possibilities that can be used to mediate or to transmit transcendence. For example, one is the use of geniuses. That you find lots and lots of geniuses in performatist movies, novels, or whatever. I think one recent example that I just happened to see was The Hurt Locker, which I don't know if you've seen that. It's about the Iraq War. And you have a sort of a hillbilly type who is a genius at taking apart bombs. You don't know why how he got this particular skill, but he's better at it than anybody else. He's indifferent to everyone else around him. He's a genius. In other words, he's somebody who is untouched by discourse, by normative rules around him. So this is one, and he prevails in the end. Obviously, he doesn't get blown up, and he goes on to keep on diffusing an endless series of bombs. This is one way that transcendence can be embodied. It's and there are numerous others. I mean, I can also go into other details, but this is simply one.
But this transcendence, it does seem to always be, or no, I shouldn't say that. Is this transcendence always in this world, so to speak? Or like, would something like magical realism fall into this camp at all, where within the confines of the work, magical things happen? Or is there an element of whatever the transcending thing is sort of, it is part of the immanent world, but maybe it uses, incredible genius as a way of transcending the world, or maybe it uses incredible technology, or there's an element of the mysterious and the magical brought in, but kind of with the understanding that, well, this is still all following the normal rules of the laws of nature.
Yeah, to a certain extent, yes. Another device that I've found fairly frequently is simply that movies will block access to information. In other words, that you'll see a movie with a particular plot, with a particular ending, and the movie will deliberately block access to the key to what is going on, so that, and this blockage of access is a marker of transcendence. Let's put it that way. If you can't understand something, if there's no way you can understand something, it's a good sign that it's transcendent. And so films, novels will also mark transcendence in this way, which can be done in the normal real world, but there's simply a sign that there's something beyond that that we're not allowed access to.
So so one question that arises too is you might hear someone say, well, how new is a lot of this stuff? I mean, transcendent things have been in the arts for forever. The idea of aesthetically mediated belief in some ways could be seen even in kind of Aristotle's notion of theater and like even just what do they call it? Um, the suspension of disbelief. The suspension of disbelief, being when you're in a theater or something, there's that's bracketed off, and you're just going to fall into the work of art and just get caught up with it. So, I mean, yeah, what would you say to someone who's like, well, what you're describing describes so many works of art going all the way back. Why is this distinctly kind of postmodern?
Yeah, well, this is actually very common criticism that somebody will say, well, yeah, in the 19th century, there was identification with figures of belief, and that, of course, this suspension of disbelief is something that you find everywhere in all kinds of works of art. The difference is the I would say the crudeness of the frame. That let's say when we're reading Dostoevsky's The Idiot, we have a Christ figure, a very complex Christ figure. We can identify with him. We can be repelled by him. We have a kind of a psychological interaction with him, but we don't have a crude narrative frame that forces us to identify with him in some way in the end. And tend to be open, in particular in Dostoevsky. This would be a typical example. In a performatist work, you are really the narrative is in a very usually very obvious way forces you to make this identification. And this is something that doesn't happen in 19th century novels. It's something that 19th century novels avoid. It's also something that obviously doesn't happen in modernist novels, which are attempting to the German word is Verfremdung. It's to alienate, to foreground things in such a way that you see the world, experience the world in a completely different way. And this is these devices are quite different than this. Once more, very rather crude narrative framing that takes place in performatism.
Do you think that, and I'm risking here the psychological move that maybe you want to avoid, but do you think that this shift to the emphasis on transcendence and that search for transcendence in art is a reaction to a world that many people increasingly feel to be so devoid of transcendence that there's a kind of interest, a thirst, a hunger for finding that in art, if nowhere else?
Yes, I think that's generally speaking true. That you can experience these things, or probably almost the only place you can experience these things now is in art. And in that way, art does provide a kind of refuge for people who want this experience and aren't able to get it in greater society or in institutional religion. Let's put it that way. So
then, again, another question, maybe one that you'll pass on, but do you see performatism as a means or a vehicle by which people could engage in a kind of re-enchantment project, a project to bring back into the world a sense of transcendence by means of not just performatist art, but also the resultant sensibility that an experience of an art or a cultural world that's dominated by performatist works would generate?
Potentially, yes, obviously, but in practical terms, it's much more difficult to convert aesthetic experience into real life experience. This is just, I think, a general observation. Basically, that would be once more, the ideal would be that this aesthetic sensibility would translate into maybe a search for more community, a search for an attempt to inspire others, an attempt to act as examples for others. These are all ethical possibilities that arise. Now, to what extent they're actually realized is something else. Which I'm not really a sociologist, and I don't have an empirical insight into how much that occurs or where that occurs. But it would appear that there are spiritual movements in America that, at least in America, certainly also, actually also in Germany, where something like that takes place.
Yeah, I know. I keep kind of forcing you to put on a sociologist hat or an anthropologist hat or what have you. But I feel like, one, your work is laid out very brilliantly in your book and in other materials that you've got online. So I want to take this opportunity to sort of get in and see, like, well, where now that you've sort of built that engine for people to be able to, understand these sorts of things, like, I'm curious to see where it can go, where it might be able to be extrapolated and things like that. And obviously I have a deep interest in these specific things myself, because I see this very much as being, well, I guess that's in many ways what I'm trying to do with my own work, and where I see a lot of this stuff being taken up and used in the service of. But so along the lines of, forcing you to extrapolate, I'm curious, do you anticipate, because history does march on, that there will be some kind of a reaction to, or some kind of a response, a kind of post-performatist response, and what might that be? I guess would be my question.
That's a question that's impossible to answer, because it's or it's very difficult to answer. Let's put it that way, because it involves thinking. It involves transcending the present situation, literally. Mm-hmm. In other words, to think in an entirely different way. And you can call it the episteme, you can call it an epoch, you can call it whatever. And it's very, very difficult. I remember myself once more when I was starting out trying to think about what performatism was, how incredibly difficult it was in the beginning. That there were just things that didn't make sense, that didn't fall into place, and that in a certain sense I had to throw away all my beliefs that I had up to then and readjust. And that's something that will happen again. So almost certainly. But you can't predict it.
Is performatism an episteme, or is it a series of aesthetic devices? Is it a theory? Is it post-postmodernism? How do you kind of think about what performatism is in the context of all these? Is it do we talk about a post-postmodernism as being metamodernism, and performatism is sort of a distinct genre, paradigm that operates within that? Or is it better to reverse that understanding? What is performatism in that sense?
Well, performatism, as I see it, it describes an epoch, which means in the same way that Romanticism describes an epoch, that it goes on maybe for 30, 40 years, depending on how things go. That is, of course, never monolithic in any way. I would say that this set towards transcendence, the use of certain devices, form a cultural dominant, the things that I've been talking about in this little chat. Beyond that, these things apply to culture in the in the narrow sense of the word. In other words, to the arts, literature, architecture, perhaps philosophy, the humanities, this sort of thing. Beyond that, it's difficult for me, simply based on my training, to make any assumptions about or make any projections about politics, about society. The question is in Romanticism or in any epoch, in any clearly marked cultural epoch, let's say Romanticism, just how much was the guy on the street affected by it? It's a difficult question to answer. Culture is usually produced from above. I think this is still the case, that professional creative people create culture. There is obviously also a give and take, because they have to have a public that accepts what they're doing. It's not, they can't simply mandate it. But my job, as I see it, is simply to describe what culture in this fairly narrow sense is doing. And I'm simply careful about making statements about anything that goes beyond that.
No, I've noticed that, and that is not with you specific. Well, yes, with you specifically, but also in one of those distinctions between sort of those looking at cultural studies from whether it's a metamodern angle or a performatist angle, kind of doing cultural studies work. I notice a great carefulness to be very like, this is the domain, whereas these developments that are occurring with some of these terms in other communities they're like, this is a grand narrative, and this is a whole political program. And I do find that to be a very significant distinction between the two camps, and might be an element or a reason why there might be some barriers to some conversational points there.
I have to admit, I find it interesting. I mean, it's fun to do, but it's difficult. I was also trained as a political scientist originally, and my problem with something like metamodernist explanations of let's say, of politics is that they tend to not to have much explanatory power. That, for example, I think in the Metamodernism book, there was a really good analysis of Jeremy Corbyn, of how his, as an old labor guy, that he was able to create a certain sense of authenticity for young people, and that for a while, he was fairly popular. The problem was that he was, in political terms, that he was then, he turned out to be a rather indecisive fence straddler when Brexit showed up, another political problem. And he was replaced by somebody who was basically his exact opposite, somebody who was very slick, somebody who was Keir Starmer, who is an eloquent lawyer and an establishment figure from the get-go. So that if Jeremy Corbyn is metamodern, what is Keir Starmer, or who is Keir Starmer? Let's put it that way. In other words, from a political science point of view, you have to have you can't explain everything using in politics using cultural.
Certainly, yeah. And I mean, and also even just the mechanics of like a democratic system make that difficult. It's not as simple as now we're in a new epoch, so that every new political leader is going to be, defined by this epoch. But at the same time, as you also noted, these vestigial elements that are still there, even if we're in a performatist epoch or a metamodern world or what have you, there's still postmodernists around, a lot of them. There's still modernists, et cetera. So, for me, I don't necessarily see that as being like a decisive element. It does certainly makes it a lot harder. And it's sort of a lot more at the whims of sort of, well, we tried this person and maybe they are aptly described by a certain epochal label. And then it's sort of like, well, they didn't work, so we'll just go with this person. And maybe that person is better described by a different epochal label or something. But yeah, point, I guess, taken in the sense that it's a lot harder to do anyway. And at least descriptively, I think, can be more challenging than prescriptive, which is another distinction I make between, or I see between kind of the cultural studies angle and these other angles, is that some folks are looking at basically what's the data, what's the evidence, and how do we describe it? And other people are sort of saying, well, thanks people who have described the world, that's a helpful framework. Now let's use that framework to prescribe what we do next, as it were. So, and yet that hasn't yet been dialectically taken back into the describing work yet. So, which I think will be interesting if and when that happens, if that makes sense. I guess I just to wind this down, then I'd be curious what the future of your work portends. You said that you still see this very much as being, essentially the dominant paradigm. Are you still working in this idiom, and are you going to be continuing to write more articles or maybe books on the topic, or what does the future of your research into this look like?
That's also a bit difficult to say. After the book on performatism, I always wanted to write a second book, and at some point I started the website, and at some point I looked at how much I had written on the website, and it turned out to be essentially a kind of a book in website form. So that I'm really not at the moment. I'm not really sure what I'm going to do. I am retiring in March. I'll have more time, and a lot will depend on just how much I want to sit down and write a formal book. And if I have the time and if I have the energy, that's what I'll do. And otherwise, I'll just keep on expanding the website. I think those are the two options. The website has proved to be a lot of fun because it frees me from writing in a stodgy academic style, which is unfortunately prescribed. Mm-hmm. And I can have more fun on the website, but I miss the scholarly rigor on the other hand. So at the moment, I'm a bit undecided.
Is there any way that you would feel well, how would I say this? While retaining the sort of academic carefulness that you have expressed, what do you kind of wish or hope or aspire to be the legacy of performatism as a paradigm? However you want to answer that.
Yes. Well, what I would like to see is that and actually what you're doing is very good because you're contributing to this, is that a discourse grows up around post-postmodernism. And this is something that has not really happened up to now. It certainly hasn't happened in academia. There is very little interest in mainstream academia in post-postmodernism. And this is, if there is any sort of legacy, then my hope would be that what I did was somehow contributed to having people think more about history, more about what is going on in culture, more about how human beings relate to reality, what belief is. I think this is also this is one of the important things for me, is that if what I do encourages reflection on belief, that would and how it works in human terms, that would make me happy.
Is that work you could see yourself making a foray into, or is that sort of poets to come sort of territory?
Yeah, I think that's something that I think I've done almost all that I humanly can to establish what postmodern is, at least from my point of view. And I would just hope that once more that this discussion,
I guess I meant around, I mean around belief in particular, around that topic.
around that topic. No, I don't really know what. I personally don't know how to go about propagating that, but simply the focus on belief, I think, in especially in academia, would be something that I would that I would hope would become more important.
Yeah. No, I share that too, though, also with the sense of it's the wondering when academia will come around to this really important topic. In some ways, I feel like maybe there's a bit of hangover from the postmodern theorizing days that people, for whatever reason, I think this is more true in America than it is in Europe, because a lot of the actual postmodern debate or conversation does seem to be, if not originating from Europe, then at least being broadly carried on. And in America, and especially in conversations that I've had with folks very recently in the academy, yeah, there's not a lot of bite there for just exploring postmodernism, and it's an interesting thing to kind of think about why that might be, and even to maybe psychologize it a little bit. But maybe, yeah, I could explore that in another time. But it is an interesting point, and I guess the last thing I would just say about that is I'm of the mind that that won't be a permanent thing, that history will continue, and we will find ourselves eventually in a point where people in the academy are going to have to say, well, what's been going on for the past 20, 30, 40 years, and what's that about? And what I'm excited about actually is to be part of sort of a non-academic context in which these ideas are being played out and are being discussed, that it will sort of be there when the academics kind of catch up to this, whenever that happens. That's sort of my take. And so when that time comes, there will be, and of course, someone like you are already in academia, and so is, say, Tim Vermeulen and that crowd, right? So there are these rich academic sources there, but then there's this whole other, actually really burgeoning community of people kind of outside the ivory tower who are sort of getting into all this and having at it. And I think that, yeah, that there's already, there was a book put out recently called Metamodernity, and it's one of its kind of subtitles was the beginning of the end, really, the end of the beginning of this talk about kind of what this is. And it is just interesting that, for those engaged in the conversation, we already recognize that so much has already happened. We're already sort of at the end of the beginning, and yet academia more broadly has yet to really kind of catch on to that. So I hope that does happen before too long. That's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, well, I appreciate very much what you're doing, simply because this is something that is a conversation like this wouldn't have been possible, or isn't possible in the academy at this point. Certainly not in Germany, and also not in America. That's been my experience, and so it's all the more important that I think informed people on the fringes of academia or outside it take up this topic, and I think and you in particular have done a really good job, and it was a big pleasure to have been here. I haven't had such a nice conversation about these things in a very long time.
Well,
certainly
thank
not
you.
in the academic, not in the academic context.
Well, thank you so much. Likewise, I mean, this has been great. It's really a great honor to finally speak with you, because I read your book years ago, and that was in part of the whole process of kind of putting a lot of this stuff out there, and very inspirational in that sense. So so it's great to finally kind of complete that loop and do this. And yeah, here's to more of this kind of stuff happening. So Raoul Eshelman, thank you so much, and take care. We'll talk soon, maybe.
Okay, thank you very much, Brendan.